This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 24 of season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, June 12, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The first section is called News Items for June 12th. Miss Harriet Hodgman, well remembered as the daughter of Reverend Edwin R. Hodgman, who was pastor of the Union Congregational Church on Lincoln Street from 1859 to 1864, and was also author of the 1883 History of Westford. Miss Harriet Hodgman, a former teacher in Westford Academy, is visiting in town from Kansas, the guest of Miss Emily Fletcher. The selectmen have posted notices warning against a dangerous speed of automobiles. It is hoped now that farmers and horses and lumber wagon travel generally will now have time to steer about as in the old-fashioned days of gee and haw. Gee and haw were commands that were given to horses when they were used to pull carriages and wagons. Gee meaning turn right and haw meaning turn left, I believe. The fare on that almost worldwide known branch of the Lowell and Fitchburg from Westford to Brookside installed another rate of fares and limit lines before sunrise Thursday morning. It is now 7 cents from Westford to Brookside, with a 5-cent fare tacked on to several cow yard bars along this distance. Better do all your riding now, as there may be another change that may take more change before ere you read these lines. The next section is called Veterans Reunion. Our patriotic Hiram Dane is to hold a campfire reunion at his farm on the shores of Long Salt Pond on Thursday, June 17th. Mr. Dane saw much service in the Civil War, and as a member of Westford's Veteran Association, he has selected this anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill to gather many of his nearby comrades who took part in the longer battle of the War of the Rebellion. Those invited are George S. Boutwell Post, GIR, that's Grand Army of the Republic, Women's Relief Corps, and the Sons of Veterans Camp of Ayer, the Veterans of Acton, Harvard and Shirley, Old Shirley Chapter DAR, the Westford Veterans, their wives and families. Boats on the lake, speaking, singing, and reading, and the old New England open barn floor for those who have a lively turn of mind with their feet. Coffee served free. The balance of the ration will be a basket lunch without any punch. Conveyances are expected at the Dunstable Road, where the electric cars will stop. The next section is the Forge Village section. The annual memorial services of the IOOF, that's International Order of Odd Fellows, were held in St. Andrew's Mission Sunday morning and were attended by a large number of people. The services were very impressive, and at the close, William Burnett, John Spinner, Frederick Davis, and William Baker, past grands, drove to Fairview Cemetery, where the graves of their departed members were decorated with beautiful floral offerings. Miss Mary L. Morton, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton, celebrated her 9th birthday by giving a party to her little friends. A very pleasant time they all had, and gave to their little hostess many pretty presents. Refreshments were served, and they departed wishing little Mary many happy returns of the day. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met with Miss Holbrook of Fensmere Farm on Thursday, and a large number were present. Fensmere Farm, that's Fensmere, was in Ford's Village and is mentioned fairly often in the Westford Wardsman in the early 1900s. It had several owners and was mostly in Groton, with 6 acres in Westford, and probably lay on the south side of West Prescott Street. It is described in the deeds as, quote, partly in Groton and about 6 acres in Westford on County Road and Railroad, end quote. Word has been received from Mrs. Nelson Prescott of her arrival at Ellsworth, Maine, where she intends spending the summer. Miss Elizabeth Kittredge, a student at Vassar, is with relatives at the Birches. Miss Randlett, a former teacher but now of Harvard, visited Mr. and Mrs. R.D. Prescott Sunday. A pleasant surprise party took place Sunday evening at the home of Mrs. M.A. Derone. The M.A. stands for Mary Ann. It's unusual that a Mrs. is given her own initials. It's usually that of her husband. In this case, her husband was deceased, and his name was Andrew Derone. When a number of the young friends of her son Emerson called upon him and presented him a gold signet ring, Daniel Sullivan made the presentation speech. Refreshments were served, and all enjoyed themselves so much that they hoped for another social time at Mrs. Derone's, for she knows so well how to make a pleasant time for the young people. Mr. Northrop, one of our oldest respected citizens, was taken suddenly ill Saturday evening, and for a time his condition was very serious. But if nothing new sets in, he hopes to be about again in a few days. Dr. Cyril A. Blaney attends him. The next section is the About Town section. Miss S. Ella Calderwood of Lowell has been engaged as organist at the Unitarian Church until the summer vacation, commencing her duties last Sunday with a ringing voluntary. She is well and favorably known to some in the rear platoon of the choir. By the kindness and efficiency of Mrs. A.J. Abbott, an organ recital will be given in the Unitarian Church Tuesday evening, June 15th, by Arthur Spaulding, organist of the Kirk Street Church, Lowell. He will be assisted in solo work by Mrs. George Spaulding of the Unitarian Choir, Lowell. The Academy Ball team will play Chelmsford High School this afternoon, Saturday, June 12th, at Chelmsford Center, and the Westford AA team, which means always active, actually AA really means Athletic Association, will play the Shirley team at Shirley on the same date. Miss Belle Walker has just returned from a visit to her brother, John J. Walker, in Natick, friends in Wellesley. Her brother, Reverend Seth Walker, while on a visit to the old homestead while out looking for mayflowers in June, the season being late, came across 3 black snakes, which he caused to become unconscious. The 3 measured 16 feet long, an average of 5 1/3 each. The Walker homestead is noted for its generous hospitality, but there is not enough of it to cover such long snakes. Hence the measurement of their days was taken as well as their bodies. Worldly mindedness of all shades of digestibility was responsible for not promptly reporting the patriotic exercises at the old Stony Brook School on Friday afternoon, prior and preparatory to Decoration Day. The schoolroom was trimmed with mayflowers, the fruitage in part of the warm April showers. There was the regular old-fashioned turnout visiting scene on this occasion and the regular old-fashioned last day fixing up. The exercises were all a patriotic forerunner of the greater event on the Monday following at the town hall. Miss Mellon, the teacher for many years, had the scholars drilled right down to the associations clustering around decoration exercises. The Boston and Maine Railroad have been installing the new automatic signal service on the Stony Brook Road the past week. This next paragraph is one of Samuel Taylor's newsy poems. Amos Poley, who was his neighbor on Lowell Road, Amos Poley has really begun to hay and has got along quite a way. He also has potatoes nearly ready to blow. Old story, early bird catching the caterpillars, don't you know? This Stony Brook Valley is an early climb if you can climb with the speed of the time. The Spaulding Light Cavalry Association will hold a special meeting at headquarters on the Boston Road on Saturday, June 19th at 3 p.m. to make further arrangements for the annual reunion and outing to be held at Nabnasset in August. The selectmen give out that there is to be another adjustment of fare rates and limits on the branch line of the Lowell and Fitchburg. Oh my, me, rates and limits change so often on this line that when you get on, you know not where your money will land you, whether on a railroad crossing or on an imaginary line, and when you return, it may be more contraction or extension. The assessors are working hard to start the sweat from the taxpayer's brow for that future when we must face our own music, the words to which were written by the voters at the annual meeting. Quote, "No discount but early interest," end quote. A new tune and a good one. I love it. We must all learn to. The alumni of Westford Academy are making preparation for the annual reunion to be held at the Town Hall at the close of the spring term, Friday evening, June 25th. It is expected that the Salem Cadet Orchestra will furnish music for dancing. Westford will have a 5th of July celebration this year, so say those active lives who are always so and would like to make the town take them and keep it so. The National Military Band has been engaged. Full particulars when full particulars arrive. The next paragraph is called Result of Railway Hearing. The railroad commissioners have rendered their decision on the petition of the selectmen for a reduction of fare between Westford and Brookside on the electric road, that is the trolleys. The report in substance says, quote, "The fare is unreasonable and excessive, and we are unable to find anything by way of comparative rates on this road or elsewhere in the state," end quote. The recommendation of the commissioners is practically an order for the selectmen, town council, and officials of the Lowell and Fitchburg to hold a conference and adjust the rate at some reasonable figure. But, lo and behold, as of old, said railroad ignores the town and does its own readjusting on a basis of no less rate for anyone, but a high rate for some. For people living at Brookside and vicinity under the new revised reduction, ascending reformation, it will cost 13 cents to get out of town. And this itself foisted readjustment from lower to higher is since the commissioners practically ordered lower rates, for before said order you could get out of town from Brookside for 5 cents. True, you can now ride under the ascending reduction scale from Westford to Fletcher's Crossing for 15 cents, a few rods beyond Brookside, where no one has any wants requiring this as a terminal for travel, or, in other words, you can ride a few rods further now than ever for 15 cents, to a point that has no point to it except the point of imposition. For be it remembered that the fare to Lowell, the real terminal, is the same now as before the decree of the railroad commissioners calling for a readjustment. On the return trip from Lowell, people a short distance westerly of Brookside could walk rather than pay 8 cents for a ride out of all proportion to rates in the state. Now they will have to alight at Fletcher's Crossing. No, they won't. They will alight off the steam cars at Brookside. That is, they'll take the steam railroad instead of the electric railway cars. For this generous reduction from lower to higher, the citizens of Westford ought to vote somebody into a vote of thanks and buy someone a plaster for their back in tipping such heavy fares off empty seats. Next is an obituary. Arthur O'Brien, who died at South Framingham last week Thursday, was a native of Westford, the son of James and Nancy Teague O'Brien, and was born at the old homestead on the Stony Brook Road, where his half-brother James H. O'Brien resides. He was educated at the old Stony Brook School, and is well remembered by the older scholars for his genial, good-natured ways and his fairness in games and plays, and many a collar and elbow wrestling match has the writer had with him. After graduating from school, he learned the blacksmith trade in Boston and for a time was in the employ of Chamberlain's shop at Chamberlain's Corner. That's at the intersection of Chamberlain Road and Main Street in Westford, not far from the Chelmsford line. Soon after this, he gave up blacksmithing and entered the employ of Williams and Company, grain dealers of South Framingham, where he remained nearly 20 years. Of recent years, he has been in the employ of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. That's the railroad that cuts through the south part of Westford, kind of following Route 27. The next section is called the Center section, that is Westford Center. The contract for repairing and resurfacing a section of Main Street, which was awarded to H.W. Tarbell of Lowell, has been completed. At the annual town meeting in March, the town voted to expend $1,000 this year on the roads at the center. The plan of the selectmen has been to finish a section of road near the residence of A.I. Bicknell. A.I. Was a Civil War veteran and lived at 2 Main Street near the Flag Road intersection, and then commencing near George T. Days, who lived at 16 Main Street, and repairing the street toward the center as far as the sum voted would permit. Last year, about $600 was expended in putting in stone gutters and catch basins to take care of the water, and this has proved a wise expenditure. Mrs. Oscar R. Spaulding has been entertaining the following group at camp this week: Mrs. Frances B. Prescott, Miss Charlotte Prescott, and Mrs. Grace and Mary Burbeck. Miss Harriet M. Hodgman has been visiting former friends in town, being the special guest of Miss Emily Fletcher. The WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, met with Mrs. Andrew S. Wright Wednesday afternoon with a good attendance of the members. Plans for the summer's work were made, also arrangements for a field day to be held soon at Long Pond, Littleton. Wednesday evening, June 16th, the subject of the Christian Endeavor meeting is on Francis E. Willard's work, and by invitation of pastor, the members of the union are to take charge of the meeting with a specially arranged program. Frances Elizabeth Caroline Willard, born in 1839 and died in 1898, worked vigorously in support of prohibition and women's suffrage. Over a 10-year period, she traveled 30,000 miles a year and gave an average of 400 lectures per year. In 1874, she helped create the WCTU and was its first corresponding secretary. From 1879 until her death, she served as president of the WCTU. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company No. 1 held their regular monthly tryout and drill last week, Friday evening, and by special request of the selectmen, wet down the section of freshly graveled road just completed. The men did a good job, but the quiet forces of nature did a better one a few hours later with a good steady downpour of rain. During the fireman's drill, Peter Clement and Henry Colburn got a thorough ducking. They were at the hydrant near George Haywood's house, which was 7 Main Street, and the men at the hydrant above, nearer the village, shut off the water from there, which so increased the pressure that these men lost control of the hose for a minute or two, getting the full force of the stream. Arthur E. Day has recently purchased of George T. Day a strip of land on Graniteville Road. With the moving of the stone wall, this increases the street frontage of Mr. Day's premises. The triangular piece of ground at the junction of Main and Depot Streets is a beautiful sight now. The shrubbery is one mass of bloom. The credit of this aesthetic enterprise belongs to our former townsman, Charles A. Chamberlain. The William E. Frost School closed Friday for the long vacation, and the out-of-town teachers returned to their respective homes, Miss Cushing to Southborough, Miss Grant to Gloucester, and Miss Platt to East Milton. The next paragraph is called Celebration. Plans for a good celebration of July 4th go steadily on under the capable direction of Reverend Charles P. Marshall. Those assisting him on the committee are Mrs. Carrie E. Woods, Mrs. Jenny E. Hartford, and Miss Mary E. Moran. At present writing, they have raised about $140. They wish and expect to make this $150. The next paragraph is the Grange. The annual Children's Night in the Grange took place last week, Thursday evening, and was a happy occasion for the little people, and was reflected in a quieter degree among the interested parents and friends. The weather was ideal for the pretty white frocks, the June flowers, and the feast of ice cream and cake. Those in charge of this successful affair were the entertainment, Mrs. Cushing and Grant, for the refreshments, Mrs. John Feeney and Mrs. David L. Grieg. Next section is Graniteville. The Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church held an ice cream social in the church vestry on Thursday evening, which proved to be a very enjoyable affair. The social was largely attended, and all had a very pleasant time. Walter, the eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. William Robinson, is quite ill at his home in this village. The last section is called Baseball. The Graniteville Blues played a picked team of local players at Hillside Park late last week Friday afternoon and defeated them in a 5-inning game by the score of 11-5. The picked nine was no match for the regulars, for the Blues played a fine article of ball from start to finish. T. McCarthy and Ledwith did the battery work for the Blues, while B. McCarthy and Heeman performed a like service for the picked team. On Tuesday afternoon of this week, Furbush Philisters met the Blues in what was supposed to be a 6-inning game. The filibusters started off with a rush, scoring 5 runs in the first inning. In the next inning, they scored 1 more run when the Blues settled down and prevented them from further scoring. In the meantime, the Blues played a hard uphill game and by timely hitting tied the score in the 6th. Neither side scored in the 7th, but in the 8th, the Blues, by good batting, aided by errors on the part of the filibusters' infield, scored 2 runs, winning the game 8-6. So that's the news in Westford for the week ending June 12th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you'll join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.